It is December 14th, 1774, and around 400 men are sailing up the Piscataqua River in the middle of a snowstorm. They land on a small peninsula where there sits the main fort guarding Portsmouth Harbor, Fort William and Mary, defended by 6 men. John Langdon calls for the commander of the fort, Captain Cochrane, to surrender. Cochrane refuses and warns the men on their peril not to enter. The British open fire, the Patriots rush. This is the storming of Fort William and Mary. After the powder alarm in September of 1774, General Gage becomes increasingly concerned about the growing resistance in the colonies. In early October, he sends a letter to King George III asking for reinforcements. In his letter, he says, "If 10,000 men thought sufficient, send 20. If 1,000,000 thought enough, send 2. Despite this request, King George responded by sending 500 Royal Marines. On October 19, 1774, King George enacted an order in council forbidding the exportation of gunpowder, arms, and ammunition to the American colonies in an attempt to prevent armed rebellion. Lord Dartmouth relayed the message to the governors of the colony. The governor of Rhode Island, Joseph Wanton, divulged word of the order, and it quickly spread to Boston. In mid-December, a rumor reaches the Boston Committee of Correspondence. A British ship is leaving Boston Harbor en route to Portsmouth Harbor. The rumor said they were being sent to secure arms and reinforce Fort William and Mary. The Boston Committee sends local silversmith, Paul Revere, who would later ride to Lexington and Concord to meet with Samuel Cutts in Portsmouth. He makes the roughly 60-mile ride on December 13th, and on his arrival meets William Torrey, who takes him to meet Samuel Cutts at Studley's Tavern. Cutts calls a meeting of the local committee of correspondence, and when they convene, Revere delivers his message. The British are coming. The Portsmouth Committee begins forming a plan. They need to take the powder from the fort before British reinforcements arrive. At the time, the fort was only defended by a 6-man garrison. It would be much easier to raid it now. Once reinforcements arrive, it would likely be too late. Meanwhile, Governor Wentworth, the governor of New Hampshire, receives word of the plan to raid the fort. He may have learned of it from a local loyalist who overheard the initial meeting between Revere and Cutts. He sends word to Captain John Cochrane, commander of the fort, to prepare for a possible attack, and to General Gage requesting reinforcements. In the early morning of December 14th, drums could be heard through the town of Portsmouth. Once they had gathered somewhere between 100 and 200 men, they made for their boats to sail up the Piscataqua. By the afternoon, around 400 men had joined, either in boats or marching along the shore. As the Patriots drew closer to the fort, it began to snow. By the time they arrived on the peninsula, it had become a snowstorm. Led by John Langdon, the Patriots approached Fort William and Mary. In an attempt to avoid bloodshed, John Langdon asked to enter the fort to speak with Captain Cochrane. Cochrane agreed, provided Langdon left peacefully. Once inside, Langdon made it clear they intended to take the powder. Cochrane refused without orders from the governor and told them to leave. When Langdon returned outside, Cochrane warned the Patriots on their peril not to enter. They replied that they would. Cochrane ordered his men not to flinch on pain of death and to defend the fort to the last extremity. He then ordered them to open fire with muskets and cannons. The shots were ineffective, and before the British could reload, the Patriots charged. The small garrison was quickly overwhelmed, surrounded, and forced to surrender. The defenders of the fort were held for roughly an hour and a half while the Patriots broke open the powder house. Around 100 barrels of powder were loaded into boats and carried away. During the raid, Alexander Scammell pulled down the British colors, becoming the first Patriot to do so from a British fort in the Americas. After the initial attack, couriers were sent across New Hampshire to gather volunteers for a second raid on the fort. In the first raid they had taken the powder, but most of the other military stores remained. The plan now was to return and take the muskets, cannons, and anything else of use. Though the Patriots knew they were on a tight time schedule, British reinforcements were already on the way. General Gage had dispatched HMS Kenku, an armed survey sloop, and HMS Scarborough, a 20-gun frigate, along with a detachment of Marines. By the next morning, Patriot forces had gathered to around 1,000 men in the town of Portsmouth. John Sullivan, a local lawyer, led the Patriots to the Colonial State House. While Governor Wentworth and the General Court were still in emergency session, the Patriots demanded to know if royal troops were on their way to defend the fort. Wentworth denied that any troops were coming. The Patriots then withdrew to the Marquis of Rockingham, a local tavern, to await nightfall. Meanwhile, Governor Wentworth ordered James Studley to walk the streets of Portsmouth and gather men to help defend the fort. Reportedly, no one volunteered. As night fell, Sullivan led the men back up the river to the fort. As Langdon had done the day before, Sullivan called to Captain Cochrane for a parley, which Cochrane allowed. After Sullivan and Cochrane met, the gates were opened to allow Sullivan out. However, as the gates opened, the Patriots surged forward and entered the fort. This time, no shots were fired. The small garrison was unable to resist as the Patriots seized about 60 muskets, 16 cannons, and other military stores. Some of the heavier cannons were left behind, likely due to the difficulty of transporting them by boat. As the Patriots left that night, they began dispersing the powder and arms inland for safekeeping. Many of the stores were hidden in the homes of Patriots and scattered throughout nearby towns. Some of the arms and munitions were likely used about 6 months later at the Battle of Bunker Hill. HMS Kenku arrived in Portsmouth Harbor on December 17, 1774, 2 days after the final raid. HMS Scarborough followed on the 19th. By then, the fort had already been stripped of most of its military stores. The raids were considered acts of high treason. Though Governor Wentworth placed much of the blame on Paul Revere and the colonial communication networks, no one was ever prosecuted. The storming of Fort William and Mary shows how quickly tensions were escalating in the colonies. In September, the Patriots proved they could mobilize. In December, they showed they were willing to fight. Just 4 months later, in April of 1775, the tension would erupt at Lexington and Concord. Thank you for watching, and if you notice any mistakes, please let us know in the comments. This is Every Battle Fought.